Analysts are still feeling bullish on Nvidia after the stock climbed over 200% last year. Stifel is one of those names and doesn't expect the AI momentum to slow down anytime soon, calling the chip stock a, quote, best idea for 2024. We want to bring in the analyst behind that call, Ruben Roy. He's a Stifel applied technology analyst there. Ruben, it's great to have you here. So I think a lot of people are asking what exactly the gains could look like here for Nvidia, at least over the next 12 months, given that massive rally that we saw last year. So what's the catalyst here for that upside to continue?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for having me. So we put out our trends report, the tech team at Stifel yesterday, and top 10 trends. We do this every year, and really it was about AI, not surprisingly, but it was more about the broadening of AI. Last year, it was a lot about NVIDIA and GPU clusters and this massive dollars being spent by the cloud service providers on building out training networks. But when you look past that, AI servers, AI PCs, there's a lot of AI innovation and applications coming behind, right? And when we looked at all the companies that could potentially benefit, guess what? NVIDIA ticks all the boxes, right? So NVIDIA is still playing in the clusters, we think. There's still going to be an investment cycle continuing for AI training clusters. But when you look beyond that, we do think that if you think about AI servers that are going to be doing the next step of AI, so we're training last year, training this year, then inference, where are we going to make the money, where the ROI is going to come from? And NVIDIA ticks those boxes. So we think it's going to be a good year. Numbers went up massively last year, but there are different layers of NVIDIA's AI strategy. You've got the chips, the hardware, which is the biggest piece, but then there's networking behind it that networks all these clusters together. And probably the most important piece that I think investors really will start thinking about this year is software. And NVIDIA came up with a software stack, CUDA, that is the ecosystem of AI right now. And if you look at Apple and iOS, the way we're thinking about it is if you can win the developer, you're going to win the hardware. And so I think that's what the next stage of the NVIDIA story for this year is going to be.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I'm wrong on this basically, because I was reading through your note and I'm thinking like this cycle is very different in that we have to go back to like a hardware investment cycle, like a lot of money spent on stuff. And then we can get to this kind of software deployment layer that we really talked about in the 2010s. That was the moneymaker last decade. Is that a trend, one, that like is actually happening? And then two, is that something that investors need to reorient their thoughts around? Because tech for so long became, well, you got to find something with 90% gross margins and buy that. And it doesn't really feel quite the same way with the AI investment cycle.
Yeah, and well, I think it will be. And it's a very interesting point because NVIDIA's gross margins are best of breed, essentially. A few companies in the semiconductor space have margins in the gross margins in the low 70s, and NVIDIA is there today. Software and other aspects of the story are driving that. But the software story is important, right? Because everybody else is sort of on the outside. If you look at competitors like AMD or Intel, they're embracing this open ecosystem. Actually, this morning, Intel had an announcement that they're investing in an AI company, essentially, for generative AI software and software stacks for enterprise customers. I think that's the right move, and I think you're going to see a lot more of that. But in our view, NVIDIA is way ahead. And so as you think about software and services, NVIDIA ends up being, in our view, the first semiconductor company that seems like they've figured out how to monetize that.
Ruben, put the risk in perspective for us, just in terms of the crackdown that we're seeing from the U.S. towards China. Lots of questions about what exactly that could look like there for NVIDIA. I know is one of the risks that you listed here within this note. How big of a risk is it really?
It's unclear. Yeah. No one knows. So, to date, NVIDIA has been able to circumvent some of the export restrictions by downsizing, if you will, the chip performance. I don't know if that's really in the spirit of the law, and we'll have to see where the spirit of the law ends up, taking us. But I am an optimist, and I do think that NVIDIA and the U.S. government and other chip companies in the United States are going to find a way to work with the Chinese. I think there's a lot more going on in China outside of bad actors. I think there's a lot of commerce companies, et cetera. And I think at the end of the day, the semiconductor ecosystem is a global supply chain. Mm-hmm. And we all have to figure out how to work together. And I think that's going to end up driving revenue growth and profitability for a lot of semiconductors companies in China going forward.
We've talked a lot. Your note is really just about like the AI, the tech behind it, and the way that's changing things. I'm curious the conversations that you've either had or anticipate kind of having with investors who are saying like, well, the Fed's doing this, so it's going to move tech, like how you think about the trade and the setup maybe, as some traders might think about it, versus the fundamental story that we're really discussing here.
Well, I guess, we're hearing a bunch of rate cuts are priced in at this point, but if you look at valuations across the semiconductor group, and Nvidia is a great point, numbers went up so much last year. Nvidia is trading at a discount to a lot of the peers in the semiconductor landscape, and I think you could find companies that are going to grow both revenues and earnings this year that are trading at or below historical sort of averages. And if you believe that AI is going to drive this margin expansion, then I think we can make an argument that we're going to see multiple expansion. So if all of that works, I think you've got upside in the semiconductor space, if this all works out. But you're right. I mean, there is some of that, kind of posturing going on, based on what investors think the Fed is going to do.
So there's more upside ahead. Outside of Nvidia, who are the other top picks? AMD, probably one of them. Who else do you like, or who else do you think is best positioned?
So AMD, certainly. AMD, in our view, is a number two, distant number two, but they're going to participate this year at the important customers, so the cloud service providers. And if you look beyond that, I talked about Nvidia and networking, right? So networking is this major area of investment, I think, coming up, because these AI networks are generating a ton of data, right? And a ton of data eventually has to move out to the edge of the network. And that's where we're all going to be using AI on our devices, on our phones, et cetera, in our cars. And as those networks are buffered, there's a lot of, sort of companies that investors might not think of that have been playing in historically, sort of these telecom networks that aren't really growing that much right now. But when you look at the cloud service providers, they're actually building huge networks like the telco service providers had historically. And so we like companies that participate in optical networking, for instance. Ciena is a company that we like a lot. Infinera is a small cap company that participates in that landscape. If you look one layer below, you've got component companies that actually make the lasers that are driving the data bits across fiber cables. And so companies like Lumentum would fit under that category. Coherent is another one we like. So there's I think, a big bucket that we talked about in the note of companies that could benefit over time from AI.
All right, great conversation. Ruben Roy, Stifel's Applied Tech Analyst. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.